HR as a whole is being shaken up. HR is going to have to really leverage AI to become a productivity multiplier, but also enable HR to move from really a reactive support function to a proactive driver of the organization's capabilities. Hey folks, and welcome back to a new episode of the Organized Chaos podcast. This is episode 29, and today I want to talk a little bit about the 6 massive changes that I'm seeing in the HR world that I think will shake up HR as we know it today. Now, before we get started, why don't you hit that subscribe button so you don't miss any future episodes? And I'm going to be making some little changes to the whole podcast format and focusing a little bit more on videos like this one, some how-to guides, and more practical things that you can take and implement on your day-to-day in HR. So hit that subscribe button to make sure you don't miss any future episodes. Now let's talk about these 6 massive changes I'm seeing. The first one is traditional HR really being under attack. And what I really mean by this, if you have been following my content or have known me for a while, and even if you're listening to this, you are probably not the typical traditional HR person, knowing that HR typically focuses on the compliance piece of things, on the more back office operation that traditionally hasn't been thought of as a strategic kind of value-adding function. Now, more and more today, founders are questioning the very need for a traditional HR department. And really the old model of HR was really built on control, right? Very policy-driven and oriented, and really has struggled to keep up with the agility and scalability that modern startups require. There's also a growing disconnect between HR's admin focus and the strategic needs of business leaders. Now, this isn't something new, right? And it's something that I've personally been talking about for years. And it's something that a lot of progressive HR people have been talking about for even longer than I have. And a lot of times you notice that HR leaders even don't really understand the core of the business they're in, and they struggle to drive initiatives that really enable the business to move forward. Again, something I've always been a proponent of and something I say all the time is that HR is an enabler of your business. HR on its own, in isolation of everything else and in its own silo or bubble, is not going to propel the business forward, really. What HR can do, though, is if you align it properly to where the business is going and you build initiatives and policies and everything that HR does around the business goals, it acts sort of like a rocket fuel that propels the business forward and allows it to reach its goals. So this is becoming more and more of a thing in today's world, and specifically with the advent of AI. And I'll get into that piece in a second, but there is a lot of discussion today happening around, especially in the startup scene, do we really need an HR function? And the CEO of XXXY Athletics recently came out and said, and I think this was in May if I'm not mistaken, said that we want to be the first company that does not have an HR department. Reason being that HR typically holds us back, they do not add any value, and they just try to tell us what to do, how to say it, and we just want them out of our business. And the CEO of XXXY Athletics is someone who was an executive at Levi's before she formed the company. So this is not something new. I'm hearing a lot of this and I'm seeing a lot of this online, and even the conversations I'm having with a lot of HR people, as well as with founders. And HR is under pressure to prove that the existence of their function is essential. And I think this is only going to get worse for HR. And by worse, I mean for specifically traditional HR. So for me, the first trend is that traditional HR is under attack. And unless you can show your value as an HR professional and as a function, companies who are not able to see value from their function are probably going to try to get rid of it in some way or the other. Now, this takes me into the second trend I'm seeing. And this has to do with AI, definitely. So Trend number 2 that I'm seeing is AI is really rewriting the HR playbook. What I mean by that is if we take a step back and go back to a couple of years ago when really AI started becoming at the forefront of everything we're doing, there was this debate, especially in the HR space. The conversation was more about HR versus AI and this butting of heads between folks who were proponents of AI and folks who were saying, especially in the HR space, that, oh, AI cannot replace HR. It's a very people and human-centric function. AI can do those things. Now, that conversation, especially over the past 6 months from my lens and during the interactions and networking I'm doing with founders as well as HR folks, is that it's become less of HR versus AI and more of HR with AI. And the reason that's happening is, of course, AI has made leaps and bounds between the last couple of years. The models that you have today are much more capable than the ones you had a couple of years ago. Now, if you also take a step back and think of, on a day-to-day basis, what is HR actually doing in most companies? And generally speaking, and I looked at different research around this to try and just quantify a little bit what the typical percentage of an HR's job is very transactional. And different studies show anywhere from 50 to 75% of an HR person's day-to-day work is generally transactional in nature. Things like answering routine questions from employees, processing new hire paperwork, scheduling interviews, running payroll. These are very transactional kind of operations. Now, automation can handle a lot of these things, but now with AI can pretty much handle end-to-end a lot of these tasks. And AI is really amazing today, and I experimented with it specifically when it comes to writing policies and procedures, which is an area that a lot of HR people tend to do on their own and spend a lot of time on. So, and there's a big compliance piece to policies and procedures because you're dealing with laws, regulations, and especially if you're operating in different jurisdictions and countries, things become very complicated. But the nice thing about AI, and especially today's recent models, is if you provide AI with very structured inputs where the room for interpretation is very minimal and it's very clear cut in essence to come out with a conclusion and an opinion, AI does a pretty good job of using that information to give you output. And things like laws, regulations, compliance, policies, and procedures are pretty good use cases for AI. What I did recently is I was developing a time off discretionary vacation policy for a company that had employees in 25 states and in 3 countries outside of the US. So I experimented in the sense of I asked AI to build the policies for me and explained where these people were, sort of the elements that I want into the policy, and it pretty much built the whole thing for me. To validate, I sent that AI output policy to a labor law attorney. And the red lines that came back are very minor, minimal things. Things that, if you want my honest opinion, are things that maybe different lawyers will have different tastes about and opinions on about changing. But for the most part, the AI model did not output anything from a compliance perspective which was incorrect. So for the most part, the policies were pretty accurate. It was really about some of the presentation elements and some of the wording in some key areas that the attorney was really trying to fix up. But again, it was nothing major. So I think AI is really going to rewrite how HR works. Now, the biggest impact of AI, I think, is going to force HR professionals to, again, just like the first point, prove why their function or even they should exist in the organization. Because if you look at it from the perspective of AI can do a lot of the transactional work, and let's say, we're going to go on the low end and say that the researcher says 50% of HR work is transactional, that's the case and not more. You have half of the HR person's time is already taken care of with AI. So HR needs to focus on very value-adding operations. And not a lot of HR people know how to do that properly. So HR is going to have to really leverage AI to become a productivity multiplier, but also enable HR to move from really a reactive support function to a proactive driver of the organization's capabilities. So HR people have a lot cut out for them to do that. A very interesting trend that I've started to hear about and seeing, but I'm not really surprised about. And that's number 3, where HR and technology functions are starting to converge and becoming one. Now, at first glance, you might think, well, hold on a second here. What does HR and IT have to do with anything? And how are they even coming together as a single function? Well, the interesting piece here, and Moderna, the pharmaceutical company, was the first one that made headlines a couple of months ago when they collapsed the IT function into the HR function. And now the leader of that organization is the head of people and technology. So the reason for that is that the integration of AI into the workplace really necessitates a deep alignment between people strategy and technology strategy. If you go back traditionally to how the HR and technology relationship functions, it is very waterfallish in design, and a lot of it happens in silos where HR would go do their own homework in terms of the technology they need, and then once they've landed on a solution, they toss it over to the IT side to get, the checks on systems integrations, security, and so forth. Vice versa, whenever IT wanted to implement certain solutions enterprise-wide, HR was almost never in the loop, and they're only engaged when it's time to roll out the technology and engage in internal comms and employee adoption and so forth. So they happened in silos, and a lot of times it became an issue of compromise between both. So today, companies are creating blended governance structures and shared roadmaps for HR and IT to design intelligent workflows. And the important thing here is that the employee experience is now dependent on the seamless integration of human processes and intelligent systems, especially with the onset of AI. And a lot of companies are thinking through, how do we improve the employee experience and how do we change the ways of working and blend between AI and human capability? So we're going to see more and more of that blending, I think, as time goes on. Now, one thing to pay attention to is that this isn't a call for me to say that, okay, just bring your IT department, your HR department, and just put them together now. The full merger, especially today, isn't right for every company. The key is to create shared accountability for outcomes and making sure you maintain the deep expertise in both domains. But this is something that I think we're going to see more and more of. Now, that brings me to point number 4, is that HR roles are getting completely redesigned. And if you can notice, a lot of these things are really connected to each other. But I think HR as a whole is being shaken up, and roles specifically are going to get completely redesigned. Job descriptions for HR roles today are starting to look drastically different than they did 5 years ago, because a lot of the administrative tasks are really going away. So the new HR professional is someone who is mostly focusing on strategic human capability. And I like to call them the strategic human capability architects, meaning that HR today is being looked upon to find the best way to enable the workforce to deliver at its best and use technology to augment those capabilities and become super performers. Now, what this means is HR today has to spend, and even in the future, focus mostly on designing work, how work is done, the ways of working, and how do you blend between technology and human. The super worker concept is really emerging in HR, and it really requires a blend of skills in business strategy, people analytics, technology orientation, and understanding in technology, and change management. So the function really is going to be moving more from sort of a peripheral support center to a strategic partner central to creating business value. Now, we all know this, especially in the HR space. This whole talk of HR needs to be strategic is all great, but I think today there's a big opportunity in making sure that that is the case for HR. Because again, a lot of times HR has struggled to be strategic, not because they're unable to, but because there's a focus on wrong things. And HR typically drowns in a lot of day-to-day work that pulls it away from the value-adding work that it is supposed to be doing. With AI, with this change in the landscape of work, the opportunity is ripe for the taking, where HR can really position itself as a function, but at the same time, the roles of HR are being redesigned and going to be changing accordingly. Now, let's talk about the fifth trend I'm seeing. And this is really going to come as no surprise to anyone, but HR teams are about to get much, much smaller. And not only is this a issue related to AI, but if you take a step back here and you look at really what HR does on a day-to-day basis, especially at companies with less than 250 employees and companies that are kind of growing, HR has a heavy workload, generally speaking, during growth spurts, when the company is hiring a lot of people, building a lot of their systems, putting their programs in place, doing a lot of change management, coaching, and so forth. When a company starts to level off a little bit in terms of their growth and scaling, especially if they've built out a lot of their operational processes, the day-to-day work for HR drops significantly. So you can make a very significant argument for smaller companies, especially those who have leveraged technology, have leveraged automation, AI, and they have well-built operations that are focused on technology and optimization of work as opposed to admin work that HR is usually bogged down with, you will see a big drop-off in the work that they do. I see this a lot personally, and I've worked with more than 150 companies across my 15 plus years in HR. A lot of times, what happens with growing companies is there is such a massive workload in the beginning as you're building everything, but when the company reaches sort of a stable state, especially when it comes to headcount growth, what ends up happening is that a lot of the work starts becoming more day-to-day operations, although the strategic element is always there and should be there, but the amount of work and lift that's there is less of a full-time job and more of a project-based or fractional type of role. Also, the drive towards cutting costs and improving efficiency is also really contributing to this. So, this is kind of the barbell effect where companies are cutting administrative and transactional roles, but they're also investing more in strategic HR talent. And this is something that, most people aren't going to expect, but you're going to see less and less investment in traditional administrative type roles, but there is going to always be a need for strategic HR people, especially at the top level. And I'm seeing more and more of this happen. So there's a critical need to retrain and retool existing HR staff for higher impact. And I think that those HR people today who are in transactional type job roles, within the next 5 to 10 years, if they do not retrain themselves and elevate their capabilities to become more of a strategic player in an organization, I think they will leave the HR function altogether. They will make career changes because those roles will cease to exist. I see that strategic HR roles are only going to become more important, but the total headcount of an HR function has become leaner, going to become smaller, and they will need to have a clear impact. But also, I think their workload is going to have a lot of peaks and valleys, especially at growing companies. Now, I do expect this to happen sooner with startups than it does with enterprises, because enterprises generally are slow moving, work on somewhat legacy systems, and making this shift away from a headcount heavy HR department to a more lean operation will take a little bit more time. But startups today are really focusing on this and delaying the onboarding of HR talent as much as they can. And I think this is going to continue into the future. And this brings me to point number 6, and the last point here, which is fractional HR is just exploding. And the reason for that, and is very tied to the stuff I talked about earlier, the workload of HR is actually shrinking because a lot of it is being handled by AI and automation and so forth. But also there is a heavy need for strategic HR talent. Now, what this means is that there are more and more people who, especially HR leaders, who are deciding that it makes more sense for them to switch to fractional roles, take on more than one company, and they can either equal their current income or even surpass it by working with multiple organizations. The other spectrum of this is HR as a function has become a little messy and super stressful for a lot of people. HR, unfortunately, has become one of those functions, especially going back to the pandemic days and leading up until today, is there's a lot of things that are getting tossed at HR. It's becoming one of those functions where if there's work that no one else wants to handle or doesn't make sense to handle, HR ends up being the one inheriting that work. So it's becoming a thing where HR executives and HR teams are becoming overwhelmed. The job is becoming super stressful for them. And taking on a fractional role really eases that up, where typically fractional consultants, they kind of have a scope of work that they deliver on. And there are certain things they don't engage in if they don't want to. And also their nature as being a contractor, specifically if they're project-based, from a compliance perspective, means that there are certain things you just cannot handle. So this is something that I'm seeing a lot of senior HR executives either come to me and talk to me about because I've been doing this for a long time. I've spoken to at least 6 or 7 people over the past couple of months who have reached out to me from my network and they're like, hey, we want to talk to you a little bit about this because we are interested in going from full-time to fractional. Some of them were laid off recently. Some of them are actually still employed, but looking for alternative employment. And they're looking for ways of either moonlighting a bit as fractional after hours, or they are thinking of making the jump completely to fractional. So I think this is going to become a big thing moving forward. From the company side of things, I can tell you how many founders I've spoken to and CEOs over the past 6 months maybe who have either come to me directly asking for fractional work or have really tried to brainstorm with me the viability of moving from a full-time, from a full-time head of HR to a more fractional model with the same people they had, or with bringing in someone who has a bit of a higher skill level, but won't really increase their total cost because that person's working for them fractionally as opposed to full-time. So the value for fractional from the company side is that, especially if you're going after really heavy hitter talent in HR and executives, you're getting a lot of bang for your buck because you can hire a top level CHRO candidate for, on a fractional basis for the cost that you would pay probably on an annualized basis for, an HR director. So you're getting premium talent for the typical cost that you're either paying today or you might be expecting to pay, which really won't break the bank. So I'll give you an example here. If you're looking for an executive level CHRO who has done scaling before, they've had multiple exits, they've grown companies from, 10, 20 employees to 100 plus, you're looking all in no less than $300,000 annually. But you can get someone like that on a fractional basis for maybe around 120 to 150K a year if they're working fractional for you, which is a pretty sweet deal given their expertise. And again, fractional folks, especially the very experienced ones, they will build operations for you where the entire people operation does not require full-time people dedication, especially from them. And they do a great job of helping you scale your organization. So fractional, I think, is only going to continue to grow. And that's really the big thing here. Also, of course, we talked about some of the AI things and the tech enablement that's happening. But also, I think the fractional model is great when you want to get very specialized expertise. So in your company growth journey, there are different levels of expertise you need at different points in time. So for example, early on, you might need someone as an organization who is a focused professional on talent acquisition. Maybe after you've hit 50, 60 people, you want to focus a bit more, let's say, on compensation. So we need someone who's a compensation expert. The nice thing about fractional and the flexibility it provides you is that you don't need to hire someone full-time who might not necessarily be an expert in all these areas. You hire fractional people as needed who have specific expertise based on your current needs as an organization. So it affords you a lot of flexibility as you grow and enables you to replace your fractional talent pretty quickly. Those are really the 6 big trends I'm seeing that I think are going to shake up HR moving forward. And The big ones really for me are definitely like the AI advent. I think is something which is continue to happen. AI is going to continue to disrupt not only HR but many other functions. The HR and IT convergence, I think I'm going to keep a very close eye on. But if companies like Moderna are doing it and other much smaller ones that I'm hearing about are actually doing it, is going to make it very interesting. And I think for those of you who know Rippling, the HRIS platform, they kind of hit it right on the head because their main value proposition when they launched several years ago was really an HR platform and an IT management platform in one. And a lot of small organizations have been going down that path, generally speaking, because there are a lot of dependencies between both functions. So I think that's going to happen. And the fractional one, we're already seeing it, but I think it's going to explode in the next 5 years. So I hope this was helpful. These are some of the 6 trends that I'm seeing moving forward. Hope you enjoyed this episode. Again, if you liked what you heard, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss any future episodes, and I'll see you on the next one.